And I think that when you were going to start with a treatise on Mary for us,
Yeah.
try to convince us all to be Marian or something. I forget what was the purpose.
Um, to be merry anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody should be happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Brian, you showed an interest in this. So just a short course in Marian theology with 2,000 years of history uh, in a nutshell. Um, because the whole actually the way in which Christians look at Mary tells you most of what you need to know about their theology, because of where the threads unravel to. So the biblical record, like we talked about, is unclear in terms of the kinds of questions we have, which would have been considered irrelevant to the gospel writers, and there's virtually no mention in the rest of the New Testament about Mary. The gospel writers tell us very little about her life, and almost nothing, except for the whole annunciation and birth, and that at the crucifixion, John was assigned to take care of her. And just a couple little glimpses in between. You can, Jesus at 12, as a basically disobedient kid, because he was busy doing something else, and didn't follow his parents, which we could probably all relate to, except that when we were in that condition, we probably weren't being brilliant among theologians. And then the wedding at Cana. The wedding at Cana is interesting because, in fact, I find it hilarious because Mary comes to Jesus and says they've run out of wine. So obviously Mary has picked up on this. We don't know who they were, but obviously Mary, was concerned about them and concerned about the absolute, social embarrassment that would have been caused by this. And Jesus says Jesus isn't ready. This is just, pretty shortly after his baptism, which for Jesus basically serves as his ordination to his ministry. The Holy Spirit comes down and essentially anoints him. So unlike what baptism means for the rest of us, that's really his establishment in ministry. So he's not quite ready to get started, and he probably didn't envision that he wanted to do it, providing wine at a wedding. But it's interesting. He says to Mary, what's that got to do with me? And Mary simply turns to the wine steward and servants and says, do what he tells you. The interaction there where, he's like, get away from me. I don't want to do this. And she just has total confidence that he will do what she asks, and that he has the power to do what she asks, as well as the will, and sure enough. So that's a very small glimpse, but a very meaningful one, biblically, into how they interacted. There isn't really much material in the first couple centuries on Mary, but eventually the church gets involved in big Christological controversies, the big question of the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries is who is Jesus? And there's a variety of answers that result in like the creeds, the Nicene Creed and so on. There's a bunch of councils. Finally, the middle of the 5th century, council designates that Mary is Theotokos. And Theotokos translates literally as carrier of God. It's often translated into English as Mother of God, but I think that's a very misleading translation. I mean, in one sense, it's true. She, carrying God, in other words, being pregnant with Jesus, who is incarnate. But I mean, Mother of God, it seems to me, goes way beyond that. It could mean that God was created by Mary instead of the other way around. But
Because goddess connotation.
Yeah, exactly. That she's the big shot, and God isn't. But understood properly, that term Theotokos designates exactly the role of Mary, and it is used primarily in those centuries as a way of proclaiming the incarnation. That if Mary is Theotokos, then the Theo, God is Jesus. So it's a way of saying that Jesus is in fact incarnate God, and the creedal formulations that he's both fully God and fully man. So that becomes very important in the theological formulation of Christology. And eventually Mary, and other saints take on kind of a life of their own. And the whole idea that you are surrounded by the saints, and that you can ask them to pray for you and intercede for you. And Mary especially, because Mary also it becomes the second Eve. Jesus is the second Adam. Mary is the second Eve, and that doesn't totally synchronize. But the point is that just as Adam was asked to be obedient to God and blew it and rebelled instead, Jesus then comes and is obedient to God. And Mary, same thing, the contrast with Eve, who disobeys. Mary says yes to God, and in a very difficult circumstance. That was, I would think, not easy to contemplate. The usual penalty for sex outside of marriage was stoning. And in any case, you can still kind of imagine how she managed to explain this to Joseph. So, she is obedient in a very profound way, and really becomes in the process the first Christian, because she really is a believer in the incarnation before anyone else. And so she becomes a role model, and becomes a very popular figure for people to ask for her to intercede. And I mean, the whole thing about the saints is something that if you come from a Protestant background, you're kind of horrified by. But I mean, you think about it. If I were sick, I could ask you to pray for me. I'm sure people have. And this is no different. The wall between heaven and earth is a very thin one for Christians. So if you can ask somebody on earth to pray for you, why not somebody in heaven? The difficulty for Protestants doesn't come so much from that as from the history of the Middle Ages, where the Roman Church set this up as kind of a accounting system, where some people were so good that they accumulated merit points, and they accumulated so many that they had a credit balance in their account when they died, and that somebody else then could ask them to, loan them some goodie points, and that would help them at the very least get some time off the sentence in purgatory, which is another Roman medieval invention. So it became this, kind of mechanical, accounting structure of merit that went completely counter to the basic rediscovery of the Reformation, that salvation is by God's grace, not by accumulating a lot of goodie points. And so that intercession got rejected as kind of collateral damage, but in itself, there's really nothing wrong with it.
There seems to be a distinction between intercession and mediation.
Yeah, well, it's really, does that saint have any it's such, glorious merit that merit in itself impresses God so much that he's willing, to accept that the saint can loan you some, instead of simply, okay, I'm a sinner, praying for you, another sinner, and you certainly don't get any reflected glory by my praying for you. God hears the prayer and appreciates it for what it is, but we're all equally sinners. And just because you're in heaven doesn't mean you have any special merit. You got there because of God's unmerited grace. So the conditions for somebody in heaven to pray for you are no different than the conditions for somebody on earth to pray for you. But that completely rejects the medieval system, and I think rightly so. And Luther, when the Reformation starts, Luther is very clear on that accepting the theological concept of Theotokos is crucial to accepting the idea of the incarnation of Christ. So if you reject the idea of Mary as Theotokos, you're rejecting the idea of Jesus as God. And that's exactly what many people have done. But all Orthodox Christians, small o, as well as big, accept the council decision in the mid-5th century that Mary is Theotokos and Jesus is Theo, is God. That is one of the lines that weeds out different Protestant groups from each other. And the Anglicans pretty much went with Luther on this, and other groups sorted out, from there on down to some denying that Mary was Theotokos, and that usually led over time to a denial of the incarnation as well. So you have a lot of Protestant groups today that reject the whole incarnation, and obviously therefore Mary. What happens on the Roman Catholic side goes in a different direction, so that in recent centuries, Mary has again become a victim of the theology of Thomas Aquinas, which is very logical and follows philosophical lines. So the logic goes, Jesus, that material is not really godly, and we are sinners. And that sin reflects in particular in our physical state, and therefore, Jesus could not be physically touched by sin in his birth. So this then posits that in order for Jesus to be in Mary's womb, that womb had to be sinless. And that then logically follows that Mary had to be sinless. And so by the mid-1800s, there was a papal declaration of dogma called the Immaculate Conception, that not only Jesus but Mary was immaculately conceived. In other words, conceived without sin. In
that doctrine, did they suppose that she was born of a virgin as well, or is that not implied?
Well, it gets a little murky because she's born. This is in fact one of the flaws I see in the whole thing. So, if in order for Mary to be born sinless, doesn't that womb have to be, immaculate as well? So, how far back do you want to go? You go back to Eve then, that there's one, family tree that's immaculate all the way back. And I don't, as far as I know, the Roman Church doesn't really answer that. But no, the concept is not that the immaculateness goes back any further than Mary. So somehow miraculously she is born without sin, even though her mother is not.
Do the medieval Romish folk, are they operating on the assumption that sin, or that sexual intercourse within a marriage is sinful? Like, I don't understand. Like, even with the perpetual virginity, are they thinking that that's sin?
Officially, Rome develops a position on sexuality that the only purpose of sexuality is reproduction. And if you are having sex, so the answer is essentially yes. In the folk mindset, that sex is seen as something, because it's physical, material, that it's something at the very least kind of really low class,
Vulgar.
And really that a more perfect life is a celibate life. And you are strongly encouraged to lead that celibate life. But if you can't stand it, you can get married and you can have sex for purposes of reproduction, because they kind of figured out that like the Shakers, we're all celibate. And guess why there's no Shakers anymore? But that it's a very negative view of sexuality, which not hard to figure out if you know traditional Roman Catholics.
So does sex stop after menopause in that scenario?
It should. Yes,
my goodness.
The only purpose of sex is reproduction. So If there's no opportunity for reproduction, you really should not have sex. So I mean,
Buzzkill.
in the fertile
Another
years,
good reason not to be Roman Catholic, Brian.
well,
Let's share that with recently married Dan.
well, I mean, he gets to say he's working on reproduction. But in a, you know, if a woman is fertile, well, you should be able to get by on 3-4 times a year, right? I mean, a couple of spares there in case. But it's and it really does. I mean, married people are less holy than people who can remain celibate. Which is why, you know, the priesthood, for instance, is seen as a higher calling than a calling where you're married. You know, I mean, much more recent Roman Catholicism has you know, Roman doctrine doesn't. Nobody says in the Roman Church, you know, that's a bunch of BS, and we need to change that. It kind of nuances itself, you know, and flexes away from, you know, the doctrine that people are not happy with, and eventually evolves rather than changes, you know, slowly to a moral, you know, to a different position. And recent Roman theologians are much more nuanced about the role of sexuality, but nobody's up and changed the doctrine.
But it seems like often when I've read about other issues regarding evolving theology and Catholicism, the response is always, well, this is what we've always believed. We're just now stating it. It's like, oh, come on.
Well, I mean, you know, I mean, in politics, it's called spin, right?
Right.
Is really the same thing. And the other thing besides that is, I think, really damaging about the doctrine of Immaculate Conception, and really its whole implications about not just incarnation, but about the godly nature of the world, that God created the world and saw it was good. Immaculate Conceptions assume that the world is by definition rotten, and the only way that Jesus could get himself into it was, you know, by somebody who was sort of by divine miracle made sinless in her womb. But it really is a total disrespect of Mary as well, because the really impressive, moving thing about Mary is that she was just like us. She is a sinner, and she's confronted with a very difficult choice and asked to obey God, and she does. Most, you know, that's an extremely impressive act on her part. And, you know, I respect her very highly for being able to do that. I doubt that I could have. If she's immaculate and without sin, well, that's easy, isn't it then? Of course she can say yes to God because she's without sin. She's totally, you know, puppet on the string. So the Roman Catholic view, which they would see as an elevation of Mary, I see actually as a denigration of Mary, and see the whole point of honoring Mary is because there was a real decision there, and you know, a real agonizing, I'm sure. And it wasn't just play acting that she said yes. And who knows how many other women God asked before he found Mary, and they said no. So, I mean, for me, Marian theology is to honor this person very highly. And so I understand when you know, the liturgical language talks about Mary as higher than the cherubim. Sure, because the cherubim didn't have to make tough choices. So this is a person that deserves honor, but not because she's sinless, but because she overcame her sin to be able to be obedient.
Is there a difference between the words honor and venerate in practicality?
Yeah, I would see them both pretty much. I don't know what you think, Michael. I'd see those as more or less synonymous in this context.
Yeah,
Because
the only thing I would
one-
say is venerate might imply an action as well, like a physical action.
right.
But, you know, I mean, if I honor somebody, that's kind of the same thing. I may, you know, I may well do that in you know, in some active form, you know, give them a, you know, give them a certificate or a medal or something, whatever.
Yeah, Michael and I had lunch together, and we were talking about the perpetual virginity, and this, I mean, you could say Mary aside in this. I know we're going to still talk about Mary, but this brings up a kind of a crucial point for me, because we were talking about early church acceptance of this idea of the perpetual virginity versus what I would describe as the plain, straightforward reading of scripture. And so the question for me pops up of, if we have this gap period of 200 years where not much is said about Mary, I'm almost suspicious of like a 200-year telephone game that went on and Mary achieves this legend status that she's now a perpetual virgin, where it could have been started out as, well, she was a blessed virgin and she's blessed, and then it morphed into, well, she was always a virgin. And it's like, well, at what point, and this is kind of the crucial question to a lot of the stuff we talk about, is when do we lean on straightforward reading scripture? When do we lean on tradition? When do we lean on the patristic writings? And it's just kind of like, and I, you know, sometimes some of these things I think I just got to throw up my hands and say, I don't know, but that's fine.
Yeah, the only thing, I mean, ultimately, there's no answer to the question because none of us were there. We don't know. And scripture certainly has no mention of it. So this is not something that you can prove or disprove. And the relative silence of the early church is also difficult to read because, you know, I mean, most of what they wrote hasn't survived. You know, stuff doesn't, you know, very little of what's written even today survives to another age. And back then, especially when you didn't have, you know, multiple copies of things and so on. So there may have been a lot of discussion about it. We don't know. So, but you know, scripture is silent on it, which tells you it could have been or not. You know, I mean, scripture does talk about Jesus' brothers, and when Jesus was 12, Joseph was still around. That's not to say they were sexually active, but you know, she certainly had a husband for those 12 years. And Joseph seems to be gone by the time of Cana, when Jesus is, you know, late 20s. But not when he's 12. I see perpetual virginity, the importance of it, as kind of a retro read. To me, again, it comes out of Thomas Aquinas's theology of the need to structure this philosophical dualism between spiritual equals good, material equals bad, or at least, really low class, which then retro reads perpetual virginity into what is a vacuum in terms of information. I don't see it as important at all. I don't think it impacts, doctrine of the incarnation. It doesn't impact her being Theotokos. She may well have been. I mean, it's a nice thought, but I don't see that if she wasn't perpetually virgin after Jesus was born, I don't see it as, significant one way or the other.
I could totally see the gospel writers or Acts even, or maybe in First and Second John, or some people, I've read that some people said to the elect lady in her church, I think it was First John, that might have been Mary. I don't know, but I could see where they wouldn't think that issue was important enough to include in the Gospels. But if the Catholic doctrine of Mary being the mediatrix between man and God was so important, well, shoot, I would think that would have been in the gospel writings, and it is not,
Yeah, you would have think somebody would have mentioned it somewhere in the first,
right.
5-10 centuries. So again, that goes back, I think, to the whole medieval Roman mechanical structure. That now, you need somebody holier than you to intercede for you and mediate between you and God. I guess I lean to the normal Protestant explanation of that that's what Jesus does.
Yeah.
Again, I can intercede for you, but I can't really, you can't, like I say, reflect from my glory in the sight of God. You're on your own. So I see that simply as trying to affect what is in fact the Greek pagan philosophers, as Thomas Aquinas very successfully to kind of shove them in the middle of Christian theology.
Was that primarily Platonism?
Mostly Plato, yeah. Although he works Aristotle in as well.
I was reflecting on our
Michael probably is bursting here because he probably doesn't agree with me.
I don't, but I do. Well, I'm part of it. I don't think that it has direct theological implication on anything. But I
think we're all agreed on that.
Yeah, I was reflecting, but I think it does have indirect theological implication. And I was reflecting on our conversation on the drive home from lunch today, and a couple things that occurred to me was like, I was mentioning it's like the proto-gospel of James or something like that, which is one of the first writings that we have that assumes perpetual virginity both before and during and after the delivery of Jesus. And that came out in the end of the second century. And but the couple things that I was reflecting on is like, you and I at one time would have said that it seems like a plain reading of the gospel or the plain reading of the New Testament that Jesus had brothers. But one of the things that was occurring to me is like, that's because in our context we call that a plain reading, but it doesn't seem like there's any evidence that anybody thought that was a plain reading for the first 1200 years of the church. And so my thought was like, well, it doesn't seem like anybody else thought that was a plain reading. They considered themselves to be making plain readings of the gospel. And I was thinking about your comment about, poor Joseph, if that was really the case. And I thought on that, I was like, like, why do we limit the miracle to Mary? Like, why couldn't part of the miracle just simply be Joseph's sexual interest as well? Like that, there's no reason that couldn't have been included in the miracle. And but but even if it was not factually the case, perhaps one of the reasons that one of the comments about Mary and the Dormition or the Assumption, one of the evidences, and this isn't really evidence because it could go either way, but it is a good, interesting thought, is that were never claimed to be relics of Mary for a church that was, for early Christians that were very interested in bones of the saints. There was never anybody claiming to have bones of Mary. And so I was like, oh, that's an interesting piece of information. Now, it may be because they already had the theology that she was assumed, and so everybody just said, no, that can't be her bones. So it could go either way, but it is an interesting piece of information to think through, because it could go, because it still could go either way. It could go as evidence, or but also with the same thing, in the middle 2nd century, you already had churches outlining their apostolic ancestry. This apostle started this church who did this and that and the other thing, but you never have anybody saying, I'm related to the Mother of God, and that's an interesting thing to me. Like, maybe it was because they already had the theology, or maybe it could go either way. But you never have anybody doing the Dan Brown.
James Brown.
You never have anybody doing the Dan Brown until Dan Brown, right? Nobody's trying to prove blood lineage to Jesus until Dan Brown, or whatever. And so even if it wasn't necessarily a particularly factually correct, who knows? I can see where in the providence of God it might be a good thing to have it as the teaching, so that we're not sitting around trying to say, doing all of our ancestry DNA tests to see which ones of us actually have Theotokos blood in us, and then, but when I was saying that I think it does have indirect theological implications. So it doesn't have. We've all agreed it doesn't have direct theological implications. There are these historical points of, a fairly univocal opinion about that this was the case for most of the first millennium, and so and when we talk about the way that we do theology, in the rule of life, it says something like, where there's greater agreement and consensus, we hold more strongly, and when there's lesser, we hold more open. And so to me, it begins to just open up there's nothing wrong with the miracle. If it was a miracle, there's nothing wrong with that being another miracle. Goodness knows there were plenty of them. Why not the miracle including Joseph? That does seem to be a almost complete consensus of the first millennium. And so once we start denying and adding in our 21st century plain reading of the Bible opinion, we've just reopened the nutshell. That really was a mixed metaphor, I know. We reopened the Pandora's box. We cracked the nutshell, to whatever we want to call
Pandora's nutshell.
Pandora's nutshell, right? And so we reopened everything, and I do think, and I may be wrong on the history, but I don't think that I am, that it's like that there's not anybody arguing against this idea for the first millennium. And I started to do some reading after we got back, but I haven't done much, just to see, like, a quick reading of online if there were these voices that were like, no, 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 that was never the case. But I don't think it was ever theologically important, so they probably weren't arguing about it. And but you know, nobody's done their my my DNA test and found out that they're related to Jesus as a great great uncle.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that in all the, doctrinal discussions and ultimate formulations as to what constitutes the Catholic faith, that perpetual virginity was never included in the unified church, which is essentially the first millennium, and doesn't become a required belief. You know, really, I'm not sure that it actually is a belief required for salvation in the Roman Church today. They'd be horrified if you didn't believe it, but and Immaculate Conception would seem to, again, you would argue against or would argue in favor of perpetual virginity, but it's never been made a doctrine, never part of the creed or anything like that. And it's partly because it doesn't ultimately matter that much. But fortunately, nobody ever made a big deal out of it and put it into a creedal formulation where you're forced to believe it. But if I were to be a Roman Catholic, I would have my fingers crossed in terms of being able to accept the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And by the way, the Eastern Orthodox do not. They have a very high view of Mary, but they've avoided that pitfall of going there. And I mean, I think the other thing is what it says about sexuality, that I mean, go back to the basics. Creation is good. God created a good thing here. Sexuality is part of that creation. Sexuality is not something you're in your your animal as opposed to your spiritual nature or anything like that. Sexuality is, in the context of Christianity, sacramental, and is a good thing, and is a good thing. And I mean, it's an ingenious invention, isn't it, for reproducing a species? I mean, he could have just made us amoeba that just split and have no, joy in it at all. So it's God-given. Whereas Rome kind of turns that around and says, no, this is almost, they don't quite say that sex per se is sinful, but it's very limited, and you got to be real careful around it, or you might end up enjoying it. And it's a very negative view, which the Greek pagan philosophers had. And Michael's right that there's the general view when people talk about this in Christianity in the first millennium is they're expressing, if they're saying anything at all, they're generally expressing a perpetual virginity, but they never push that. And there are some sources in the first millennium where Christians are not accepting it. Nestorians, for instance.
No, when I was going to say, when they express this in early writings, are they saying it more like a title, like, oh, the ever Virgin Mary, or was there people early on actually writing she never had sex? Were they explicit in their
There
thoughts
was
on
a
this early on?
term. There was a term. Let me see if I can find it. The Greek term.
Because I can also,
Parthenogenesis, is that what you're looking for?
What did you say?
Parthenogenesis?
Parthenogenesis. Wouldn't that be the assumption? I mean, the Immaculate Conception?
Well, it's somebody's immaculate conception. It usually refers to Jesus.
No, no, it had to do with Ever Virgin. I'll find it. Talk amongst yourselves.
so I could also see, you know, let's say we don't, I don't know if this is the case. We're probably for fun gonna have to study this more, but let's say that this doesn't get really talked about for the first 200 years, and there could be a little telephone game on it. Well, I'm imagine you wouldn't want to be the guy who says, no, actually, Mary did have sex. I mean, it might be in that culture, it could be the equivalent of doing a yo mama joke against Jesus, you know? And so I don't know that this is not important, but it's important in the sense to me of when do I go with scripture? When do I go with tradition? I'm very nervous about the Council of Trent and them saying that they're equal. And I'm very nervous with the second Council of Nicaea in 787, where they said, let him be anathema who rejects either written or unwritten tradition of the church. That makes me nervous.
Yeah, well, on the latter one, you have to read tradition as with a capital T there. It doesn't refer to traditions, doesn't refer to, you know, somebody's idea of you know, how to carry the chalice or something. It means the agreed upon received belief of the church. So essentially, you know, almost synonymous with the creeds. So that one I'm not too uncomfortable with. But the other really important dividing line is this going to affect your salvation? If it's not going to affect your salvation, why? There's no reason not to kick it around and believe what you think, you know, what you want.
I think I hold closer to the decision of accepting it. Because I do think I think that it's just important as for an epistemological reasons. Like it's something that was the word is, I don't know how you say it, but the prefix is AEI.
Hey, Parthenos. Yeah,
And that means ever virgin.
yeah, that's right. I like Ionis, you know, everlasting, and Parthenon is virgin. So yeah, ever virgin's a very accurate translation of that.
I'm looking. I can't. That was the word that I'd come across. It is Greek. I don't know the history of when that word was first being used. That's what I was trying to look real quickly, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah, I don't know.
But to me, it's the important, like the reason I would argue for the perpetual virginity is just because of the whole manner in which I do theology of that which is clearly consensus. I accept preferential to my own opinion. And that which is clearly hetero, I choose my favorite. And so,
Well, and I get that, and I appreciate that, but it's like anything when you take it to its logical extension is, well, what if I say the consensus is now over the first 1500 years of the church, and now I can say that, well, purgatory was highly thought of for that period.
No,
And
I
that
do.
sort of thing.
I think you do consensus differently. Like, you don't get to just do that's doing a cross section. You know, um, purgatory has never had a consensus. It developed as an idea later and was only received in part of the church. Been received widely, and for that reason, like, I would maybe put it in the hetero class, and if somebody wants to believe it, okay, maybe. I don't, but there's no argument to be made for something like purgatory as being of having the consensus of Catholic Christianity.
I had a Greek friend who said it's the best piece of real estate the Roman Catholic Church ever had.
Yeah, but that, like, when you do consensus, you have to, like, the way that I think of it is it's building, and so things that come ex nihilo later on in the life of the church, that doesn't mean they're wrong, but was the things that were said before that outright deny them or inconsistent with them? Maybe not. And if there weren't, then hey, maybe that was just a new discovery of the depth of the Christian faith. But if you have something like purgatory, which seems to come ex nihilo late in the game, then I feel like you have to look and say, okay, well, there's other things that the churches believe that don't seem to jive with purgatory.
What about the opposite? Do you know of any examples of widely held consensus beliefs from the first 600 years of the church that were later abandoned?
Perpetual virginity.
Other than that,
Women in the diaconate.
Women in the diaconate. Well, it depends on how far you go. There's churches that don't believe in the presence of Christ in the Eucharist now. There's that's not gonna develop until after the Reformation, after the Protestant
no,
Reformation.
I mean that were consensus for the first 600 years, and then a new consensus was made that reversed the position. Not this wacky church believes
a new consensus was made. I don't know of anything in which that was the case.
Yeah, like I say, the women in the diaconate, if you go to the Roman church, again, priestly celibacy, but that was never accepted,
by Eastern, no.
in the East at all. So, they're still consistent with it. Every example I'm thinking of, except women in the diaconate, is really an example that happened in Rome, not and was not carried through by the Eastern Church. So I'm having trouble thinking of something that has been universally reworked, East and West, other than that.
And there would be
what about slavery?
Although my opinion is more like the bishops, I would say that there are people who would argue that the position of women in the diaconate hasn't flip-flopped completely.
Well, it's kind of recovering a little at the moment, but it was a long dry spell.
Well, what I meant was our bishop would argue, I think, whether or not women in the diaconate looked like it. I'm still learning, but I would say that you and he have different opinions on the history of women in the diaconate.
Yeah, and he would say it's necessary for the integrity of holy orders to regard all three as the same, and therefore, if if women can't be priests, women can't be deacons either. But that's a theological argument. I don't know how you can deny the historical argument, because it's overwhelmingly there's historical proof. There St. John Chrysostom, the great leader in the 5th century, there were 40 women deacons in his church, big church. But I mean, there's canons in the some of the ecumenical councils referring to how to what women deacons are about, and setting an age limit for how they have to be at least 40 in some of the councils. But no question that there are women deacons, and that they're accepted as part of the scenery.
Right, but we don't.
I don't.
I'm not trying to argue that directly. My point was that I think that people would argue what that meant, what they did.
Those are very late arguments. The arguments that say, well, but they were made deaconesses. They really weren't, real deacons, and they, only could do these very small functions, and they weren't ordained to do it. But that doesn't stand up very well, because I mean, the word that's used both in the New Testament and in the early centuries is keratonia. Ker is the word for hand in Greek. Keratonia is to lay your hands on, and it's the same word used for male and female ordinations to the diaconate. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty hard to try and argue that these are somehow differentiated, that one's an ordination, the other really isn't. So I think that's pretty absolute. But this discussion is absolute answer to Brian's question. Yes, there was a practice in the early church, or the church of the first millennium, that was discarded by the later church, and many people in the current church still regard the modern view as the correct one, and would refute the view of the early of the first millennium. Marriage is also another one where for the first millennium the church stayed out of the marriage business, and if you were a Christian and you wanted to be married, you went to the Roman authorities, or whoever, with the civil authorities in charge, and you did a civil ceremony, and it was regarded just like, modern marriage. You made a contract with each other that had certain conditions with it that you honored in the marriage. And then, then you went the next Sunday to the Eucharist and celebrated the wedding with the congregation. But the priest did not, preside over the marriage. The civil clerk did. So that's another, big difference in practice.
So, in y'all's opinions, regarding doctrine, how far into modernity would the development of doctrine by consensus apply?
Well, it's still going on.
Okay, that's what I figured you'd say, but from the historical context, it sometimes we wonder, well, if we're in keeping with the apostles' teaching, then that was the teaching, and then we're looking back to it, but in what way does it still go on? Was kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, you have this Catholic doctrinal consensus, and And the Greek word for it is for tradition is interesting. It's paradosis, which means a gift that you pass on. So in other words, you receive the gift and you then are obligated to pass it on to the next generation. So that's the concept of how tradition works in the church. And each age takes that received consensus of faith and applies it to the new conditions or partly new conditions of the new age. You know, I think of how, for instance, the Pope in particular is applying the doctrine of creation to climate change. And he does it very creatively, and totally within Orthodox Christian received belief. So that's the best example I can think of how, you know, doctrine is still dynamic. It's a living animal.
Thoughts, Michael?
No, I agree with the consensus continues, and I think that it's like you know, we're continually confronted with things that have not come before. And yeah, so the church still has to work. And new thing, like we've the whole you know, I think we spoke about this earlier, but the conversation on THC and psychedelics or whatever, those are new things for the most part for the Christian conversation. There are conversations that have come before that we can look to, but for the social acceptance of mushrooms and LSD and THC and whatnot, those are we're a new playing field, but we have to use the consensus that comes before us to develop what we're going to project into the future.
That's actually the fun part.
It can be.
You know, it's yeah, and it can be very difficult as well. You know, trying to figure out all the gender debates, for instance, right now, and get a consistent Christian theology of them, other than just saying, you know, hope it doesn't happen here,
Mm-hmm.
is you know, really difficult to work through.
Yeah, and that's you know, like even that, like, so we may have a consensus opinion on the simple idea of homosexuality or bestiality, but how do you apply that if a lesbian couple with a adopted child, or even worse, a child they actually carried from artificial insemination, started coming to our church and wants to worship with us? Like, that's a social reality that's never that's never been before. And how does the church going to respond to that lesbian couple with a child? Am I supposed to require that they divorce and move out, and the kid now has divorced parents? Am I supposed to require that they can stay together, or they need to live in separate rooms? You know, like
So Joseph did it.
maybe he may have. And see, there again, the perpetual virginity comes up as a helpful theology.
I know where the modern line goes on this. Joseph was probably gay, and he was just using marriage for cover.
But you know, like
Another,
we don't yet have an answer to that scenario I just gave you. That's a gospel answer. I don't know what it is. And but whatever the answer would be, it's going to have to be consistent with everything that Scripture teaches about human sexuality and families, but also about love your neighbor. Um,
yeah,
and
and pastoral care.
what's that? And pastoral care. And so we don't have an answer to that question.
Another big one is population control. There's never been a time in the history of Christianity where there've been 7 billion people crowded onto the globe, and a lot of indications that the planet cannot sustain 7 billion people for forever. So what is, I mean, the traditional Christian answer was be fruitful and multiply, but at some point that may need some amendment.
I can hear the Catholics snickering. We were right, weren't we?
I'm reading I, Robot by Isaac Asimov right now, and one part he's writing into the future, obviously, when there's sentient robots and AI, but he says that the year is 1993 and the population already reached 3 billion. I'm like, oh, that was an underestimation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's just like most of the things in 1984, have already happened.
Yeah.
And moved on. So yeah, I mean, this is a new situation that the church has never dealt with before. There's never been a time when the planet was so crowded that it is looking like there's not room for everybody. So that means you have to rework that receive consensus. It doesn't mean you have to change it, but you have to be able to apply it intelligently.
Just wanted to point out that it's 6:45. I'm here, but just don't want Brian to get in trouble.
We completely fabricated a meeting without the rubric for past the time. That's impressive. Love it. Well, it's good we didn't jump ahead without Chris.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Is this is the conversation I'm sure Chris will be interested in and can watch the recording, but I think it was primarily your conversation, so it seemed to fit well.
That'll work.
So cool. Any other questions or insights, or you want some more fodder against Dan?
Oh, how could I go against Dan though? He's too nice.
He's very thoughtful though.
Trying to think if there was. I know there are more questions, but we'll come up with them when we do. Oh, this kind of goes back to the when do we. This may be a little bit more concrete than the Mary issue, but something that caught my interest the other day was thinking about, okay, the liturgy of the church and over time, and when did it develop? And then when you go back and read Paul about when he's talking to the churches in the epistles about orderly conduct worship, but then he's mentioning these things like when you pray in tongues, have an interpreter present. When you prophesy, these kind of things, that those are not present in the liturgy, but the way he's describing it doesn't seem like a prohibition, but it sounds like he's saying that in Christian believer church gatherings that this stuff did go on. And so I'm not advocating that we start, speaking in tongues at Trinity or something, but I'm
I already
wondering.
do.
Well, so do I, but the issue is the slight disconnect I feel between the liturgy that formulated somewhat later on, maybe not that far later on, and then the way things were conducted in the New Testament in an ordered church worship.
Well, the liturgy develops what, 700 or 800 years before Christ. The early Christians simply applied the Jewish liturgy that they had received, and again, good example of how you take theology and apply it to a new situation, and use that Jewish liturgy to express the new context of the Christian faith. So it's been around a long time. It had been around a long time at the time of Jesus. And our present liturgy is a combination of two Jewish worship services. The first part of it is the worship service of the synagogue. And if you go to a synagogue, you'll see a lot of connection to the way in which we worship for the first half, up through the sermon. It was called the service of the word. And the second half, the Eucharist, develops out of the Last Supper, which was a celebration in Judaism called a Kaddish. That was a celebration among friends for some significant event or other, combined with the Passover celebration, which, the Holy Week is the same as Passover and is intimately connected to the Passover. Christians see the resurrection as the new Passover, or see the original Passover as a prototype of the resurrection, whichever way you want to look. And eventually people got tired of those being separate and put them together into one service fairly early on in the history of the church. The basic structure of our current Eucharist is pretty, I mean, the basics are the same. They haven't changed. By the 4th or 5th century, you'd recognize it if you walked into it,
Right.
we're having a liturgy. But I mean, it goes way back. And even a lot of the liturgical phrases and so on have been there, for before Christ in some cases. Things like talking in tongues. Yeah, I mean, Paul, obviously they were doing it because he, comments on it. And he advises them that it'd be better if they did that, in private, so as not to disturb other people, or, as you say, get an interpreter, so that everybody can be edified by this. And I would think that practice then as now hasn't really changed much. Not much in Christian worship really has.
And I'm not advocating that at Trinity we start adding a bunch of freeform worship or something, but I'm totally sold that liturgy is beneficial and it's highly needed and a beautiful way of worshiping. But when I read this stuff about Paul, it makes me wonder, was their entire service scripted? It sounds like there was some freeform stuff going on. And so maybe the answer is context, like he's talking about just a gathering that wasn't the Eucharist celebration on Sunday or whatever it was. But the thought popped in my mind.
There was more freeform, like even like, so we have a set Eucharistic prayer. In our prayer book, we have two that we can choose from. But there was certainly a concreting of that. Like for at the beginning, it was the bishop would be up there praying, and I'm sure it's like, you know, you go to 7 different houses and you listen to a dad who prays for the meal every night and you hear 7 different ways, but if you go to one house 7 times you hear one way, you know. And so that kind of is most likely the way it developed, because the bishop would be up there and extemporaneously praying over various things about salvation history and what was accomplished in the life, death, and resurrection and ascension of Christ. And you know, there are some of the prayers that we have where there's conversations about bringing in the idea of the wheat growing in the fields, and now it's going to come into us and then go back out, you know, all kinds of different things. And then just over time, you can imagine, especially if there was a bishop who was more trained and then he begins to have more congregations that he's in charge of, so he begins sending his presbyters out there to do this, and he's just like, just say it this way. You know, and so that he's not worried about whether they're going to go wandering off into la la land. He just gives them something to say when they go out there, and then over time these texts become more and more standardized, and then we end up with just a smaller set of texts that get passed on and shaped.
Yeah, so the key is there's a freedom, but within the structure, within that Eucharistic prayer, the bishop covered certain points every time. But the way he covered them, the way he phrased it, could be, you know, could be his own. Combined with that, there were liturgical formulas. Lift up your hearts, for instance, goes all the way back. That were always there and never varied. So it was a combination, but always within a very careful structure.
Are there, well, I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I'll just go ahead and ask it. Are there ACNA churches that do kind of hybrid type liturgies that you know of? I'm not arguing for doing this, by the way, Michael.
No,
I'm just wondering.
Yeah, there's a, you know, pretty good variety of worship practices in ACNA. I'm not quite sure what you mean by hybrid. You mean a combination, like spontaneous and
like if they lean harder evangelical or evangelical charismatic.
There was a church in Atlanta that came out of the Vineyard. I've never been to it, but a friend of mine went to it. And he's like, I couldn't see how it was Anglican. All they did was they prayed the confession, and then they said, "The Lord be with you," before they started talking about the communion. But other than that, it was a Vineyard church service. And this church had been in the ACNA at this time for 8 or 9 years. So it wasn't like they had just switched into the Vineyard. That's some of the excesses that my former diocese had, of not grounding people well in what the Anglican tradition was, and just kind of throwing them at a prayer book and said, "Hey, here's some neat things. See what you like."
Yeah.
And so within the ACNA, there is a plethora
Yeah.
of practices.
My
But,
problem
Well-
with it is that if you're going to do that, I expect you to really be well educated in how is in liturgy.
right.
But unfortunately, I think it's almost a reverse phenomenon that the less you know about the history of Christian worship, the more likely you are to, think up something on your own. And I have never met any kind of liturgy or non-liturgy that was as good as what the church has field tested for 2,000 years.
Mhm. I've been reading this book, The Heritage of Anglican Theology by J.I. Packer, and he had a good point. Well, he was talking about broad church versus the evangelical versus Anglo-Catholic, and the way he put it was the evangelical stream tends to think of there's crossover in this. He wasn't he is generalizing, but the evangelical tends to think of spirituality as an internal thing that then outworks itself into your behaviors and so forth. Where he described the Anglo-Catholic view as you coming under tradition and ritual, and these external things aid in helping your internal spiritual life. And I was like, I should run that by them and see if they agree with that.
I think both end.
Yeah, that's how I saw it. That's kind of how he was saying it too. But yeah,
I mean, as a generalization, I think that kind of sees the value in both.
he was less generous with how he spoke about broad church liberal liberal theology. So
Let's see. Low and lazy, broad and hazy, high and crazy. Are the way I heard it expressed.
that's funny. Well, this was fruitful.
Good.
No, it was fun.
And we'll get back to the well, not back. We'll start on the blue book next week.
And enjoy Darwin.
Oh, we'll do. Yeah, I already read the first chapter. It's good.
Yeah,
Good,
I mean, I don't
good.
agree with everything he said, but I think it's a good, study of it.
How do you have time to do all this reading and audio book listening? He sends me a new audio book almost twice a week.
I really don't understand it myself. Like I look back, I'm like, how did I finish all these books? Because I'm so busy I'm working, I'm playing with the kids, and I really think it's before I go to bed. Usually before I go to bed, I will read quite a bit, and I read pretty quickly. And then usually when I'm doing something, like the kids are upstairs taking a bath and I'm doing the dishes or I'm driving to work, lots of times I'll be playing an audiobook. The issue of how I'm able to do audiobooks so fast is I pretty much always listen between 2 to 3x.
Oh wow!
And
my ears don't work that fast.
It's honestly it's good and bad. I that's how I did medical school. I didn't go to class. I would listen to it on fast speed, but it's a struggle for me even at church or having a conversation with someone. If people speak too slowly, my mind just it's gone. I'm thinking about something else. It's gone. But if people talk quickly, if I'm listening to something quickly, I'm right on track. I don't know. It's a weird thing.
Well, it's basically a gift.
Well, I hope so. So able to read a lot.
Sometimes people that speak slowly say very wise things, but that you might miss. But
It's
you know,
true.
for most of dealing with life, I think it's a gift.
So
Well, I'll let you go get your 10-minute read through the J.I. Packer book and give me the summary.
well,
I'm very different. When people speak quickly, I just kind of hear a hum and kind of tune out. And I'm a slow reader, and I read a sentence or two and think of all the implications of that, and then kind of read a little bit longer, and then simmer on it a little bit. And so,
Jackie's a very fast reader too. But she doesn't read a lot of nonfiction. She plows through a ton of um, a lot of Christian fiction that is speaking a lot of truth through a story. So that's primarily what she reads.
interesting.
Yeah, but very quick. She can devour a book.
Hmm.
So yeah. All
All right.
right. Well, I'm gonna go help put these kids to bed.